in about 1 minute. Okay, good morning, everyone. You've successfully joined the workshop on the staff proposal for a procurement framework in integrated resource planning. David, can I just check you've started recording?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. I'm Raffan. I'm a regulatory analyst on the IRP team. And I'll just ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. Got Molly, Karolina, Nathan, and David. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Molly Sterkel, and I'm a program manager in the energy division, overseeing infrastructure, permitting, and planning. I've worked on long-term resource planning since 2005, and I'm delighted to be a part of this workshop today.
Good morning, this is Nathan Barcic, Supervisor, Integrated Resource Planning. I'm very happy that you all joined us this morning and looking forward to the conversation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karolina Maslanka, and I'm also an analyst on the IRP team.
David Withrow, an analyst also on the IRP team.
Thank you. David, if you could just switch to the next slide and we'll just start off with the logistics for the workshop. We've got about 6 or 7 main topic areas. So diving straight into the next one. Okay, so these slides that we'll be walking through today are posted to the IRP procurement track webpage. We are recording this workshop. It's not for the IRP proceeding record. The staff proposal itself already is, but rather the purpose of this workshop is to advance stakeholders' understanding in advance of eventual written comments. So we're not seeking comments directly in response to this proposal right now or the workshop. And I'll just call out a couple of out-of-scope items among probably others. The aggregation of LSE's IRPs and the formation of the preferred system portfolio is out of scope. So is the actual analysis associated with midterm reliability. Next slide, thanks, David. So yeah, we really want to provide this opportunity to advance stakeholders' understanding of the proposal. The proposal, if you haven't seen it, is linked in this deck, as well as on the IRP procurement track webpage. It was released via an ALJ ruling last month. So in the workshop, we'll have Q&A sections after each topic, and we invite clarifying questions there. We ask that you please don't advocate at this stage. There will be the opportunity to do that in written form and possibly via a workshop early in the new year. So to facilitate questions, a few details here. Everyone's on mute at the moment, so to ask questions when we get to the Q&A sections, either please raise your hand using the icon in WebEx if you're attending via your computer, and then the WebEx host will unmute you to allow you to ask your question. Please remember to lower your hand afterwards. It helps us keep track of remaining questions. And then on the next slide, we detail that if you're dialing in by phone, it's a similar concept, but you just dial *3 to raise your hand and then lower it. So please remind it to lower your hand. In addition, you can raise questions via the chat room feature of the WebEx, though we will give priority to those who've raised their hand. We ask that each stakeholder asks one question at a time, and so we can cycle through fairly. And if we don't get to answer all the questions that get asked during this 2.5 hours, please just email what remains. We will capture the ones that are in chat, but if there's something that pops up you didn't get to ask, please email it to me by the end of today, and we'll determine an appropriate way to respond. Yeah, so just do it by today. This is not intended to be an open-ended discussion. As I said, the Commission will be seeking feedback on the proposal early in the new year. Okay, so moving on to the framework itself and its background and purpose. Just to orient you firstly on the way we're presenting this, we are staying close to the content of the staff proposal. We're trying to call out where we're referring to particular sections, like in this example here, section 2.1. The document does cover a really broad range of issues and options and topics. And so our aim here is that by hearing from us in the limited time we've got, it'll help our stakeholders to digest the content. So firstly, background, we're in the second cycle of IRP. It was very planning focused. The decision in April last year that adopted the preferred system portfolio from the first cycle initiated the procurement track in IRP. So some definitions here, I'll just call out. So we've basically got these two parallel tracks in IRP, the planning track, the planning associated activities, procurement track, procurement related activities, including the development of this framework. When we talk about a step in procurement, it's basically a particular part of the process of procurement. This presentation and the document is structured according to those broad steps in procurement, and all the steps together comprise the process. And then the framework, is basically the process, but as well as the context. So the guiding principles to it, just so that the steps hang together. So that's what we mean by all that. And then moving into the procedural background, we describe in the proposal what we believe what we believe of the CPUC's jurisdictional authority is relevant to procurement. And the sections of the Public Utilities Code are listed here. Basically, the IRP part of the code, as well as the resource adequacy part of the code, potentially among others. And then in the IRP proceeding, the first major decision in the procurement track of IRP was the November 2019 decision ordering procurement 3,300 megawatts of system resource adequacy resources and recommending extension of the 1-3 cooling generators. So that's D19 1116, and the staff proposal refers to that a lot because it's a useful reference point as we think about what future procurement might look like in IRP. Okay, and then just onto the purpose for the framework itself. So this staff putting together this framework is intending to provide decision makers, parties, and procurement entities with credible options and recommendations on the design of an IRP procurement framework. So section 2.3 of the proposal is quite foundational to the document. It frames the broad procurement paradigm that we've used to put forward options and recommendations, which is essentially using existing programs and markets as much as possible, plus the planning track guidance in IRP to rely on those as much as possible for optimal procurement, and then using procurement orders by exception. So procurement orders feature heavily in the proposal. The proposal does consider interface with other programs and markets, but doesn't go. But those are out of scope in terms of actual changes that might be needed in those programs. Okay, so I've just quickly describe the how we've reached to this point here, and I'll just now hand to Molly to address more about the why. Thanks, Molly.
Thanks. So now that everybody is warmed up and has their morning workshop brain turned on, let's get into the heart of the problem. So staff have been motivated to work on this framework for quite some time. As Neil mentioned, the commission first signaled its intention to work on something like this in April 2019. And we understand that how we got here, because the first two cycles of IRP really focused on planning, and with the exception of the decision in November 2019, the IRP program to date has been more focused on the planning side of the IRP framework. So this proposal is really signaling a shift in our understanding that the IRP program has to naturally expand and encompass all aspects of procurement. And we, like many stakeholders, were not fully satisfied with the process that we went through that led to the November 2019 decision. And we knew that we could and should adopt a more rigorous approach. So the thing that motivated us were these overarching problems, and I'm going to describe the problems here, and I think they're described pretty well in section 3.1. But just also remember the where we are is we are that has undergone tremendous market fragmentation over the past few years. We've had this huge growth in CCAs and ESPs. We've also had a huge growth in RA program citations. So it's a very complex environment for us to try to focus on a few problems. But the staff were very kind, and they said, well, Molly, you talk about the problems and we'll talk about the solutions. And so I agree to do that. But remember, if we don't really see the world the same way, if we don't agree on the problems, then the solutions that the staff talk about are not going to make make sense. So I think it, like, for this part of the proposal, as well as all the rest of today's workshop, I really encourage people to have ongoing conversations outside of this workshop to see if we can get on the same page. So, the staff here is fostering a dialogue with this proposal and with this workshop, but we hope that the dialogue continues outside of this webinar today. So basically I'm just going to now actually really start talking to this slide. So the planning and procurement processes that we have to date are really not sufficient to ensure that we have a reliable system. We took that first step in November 2019. We ordered 3,300 megawatts of procurement. We have very encouraging LSD progress on new procurement that's been achieved. The status of new resources expected link here on this slide links to a deck that we worked on to demonstrate to people what we have seen to date, that resources under contract. We do believe that there will be several gigawatts of new resources online by August 2021, and that's extremely encouraging. But the electric grid, still has, sorry, there's a little bit of a typo here. The electric grid, still has barriers to market entry and exit. There is not ease of market entry and exit. And so it demands that we, have other processes and regulatory structures in place to ensure that reliability can be achieved. And I think that we've been talking for a long time, well over a decade, about how to manage the need for existing resources to receive adequate capacity and energy payments to want to stay in the market. And we just really, in this proposal, we wanted to highlight that we think that problem is going to become even more noticeable in the future as zero marginal cost resources, eventually dominate the energy market in the future. Again, we also, have the backdrop of the heat storm of 2020. We even before the heat storm of 2020 and the issues that arose on August 14th and 15th, we already were seeing, the PSPS, electrification, wildfires, putting heightened pressure on the need for consistent electric grid reliability. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So some of the specific proposals, problems that this proposal are seeking to address, I'm just going to highlight that, a couple of them here. We have, a situation where the IRP has established plans and all of the LSCs have submitted the plans, but we don't yet have a clear way of making sure that those plans translate into procurement and that procurement actually shows up in the RA cycles. So that's what we're talking about, especially there in that fourth bullet where we're saying that weak alignment between IRP and RA. And I think another issue that we've had that's really challenging is that we're doing this planning while the system reliability metrics and planning standards are evolving in response to the high penetration of renewables. We spent several years trying to think about, we thought about planning in terms of what resources are needed to ensure renewable integration. And at this point, I think it's clear that, the entire system that will be built in the future, all of it will be used to integrate renewables. And so the last thing I think I really want to touch on here is that on this slide is that ensuring reliability in this fragmented market, is challenging when there are development risks associated with new resources. So it's not new that there are development risks associated with new resources. We've seen that in the energy market for a long time. But when you're trying to ask many LSCs to develop and assign some responsibility to develop resources across a wide array of LSCs, how do we account for the fact that basically in simple terms, some projects will drop out? And so although we've made some progress on how to manage compliance and manage this complexity, and I think yesterday the Commission's decision, we've been referring to it as the backstop decision, and there's a link to that there. It's not even a fully published decision yet, but I think it shows that we've made some progress, but even as we were working on that, we realized that there was more we could do. So that's sort of the origin story, as it were, for this proposal. And if I could just wrap up on the next slide, my remarks. Go ahead, David. So one of the things that really motivated this proposal also was this recognition that different types of resources had different, here it's called procurement characteristics, where there's kind of a continuum between some types of resources might be really straightforward to contract for, maybe import contracts or batteries, something that, can kind of come to order in a short term. But those resources may still require a procurement order. And then there are other resources that take a bit more time to develop. This is, we get into the middle row here, maybe solar, wind, and geothermal. And again, those might require a procurement order and ongoing monitoring. But then there's another category of resources, these long and complex resources, pump storage, out-of-state wind, new transmission, offshore wind. You're going to hear about them throughout the entire workshop this morning. And we were really recognizing that we needed to be able to plan the system to accommodate and utilize all of these different types of resources, even though they had different timelines and different levels of ease of procurement. And so that was one of the problems that was really foundational for the framework which you're going to hear staff describe today. And I think that's where we can kind of end this opening section. The last thing I would say is, just the staff is going to do a great job presenting this proposal today, but I really want to, again, encourage people, today is for asking questions and clarifying, make sure you understand, what was written. But I really do want to encourage people to, if you have other ideas, if there's, if there are more options that we should be considering, if there's a new way that, you can present to us that something that we didn't think of, please, when it's time for comments, we will definitely be ready and all ears to hear that. So thanks for that. Turn it now to questions.
Thanks, Molly. Yes, we've got about 5 minutes here to address questions that may have arisen on the topics we just discovered there. So just a reminder to do so by raising your hand in WebEx or on the phone by a staff read.
Andy Brown, I see your hand raised and you are unmuted now.
Just caught me with a mouthful. Sorry about that.
We hear you.
My question is, to the extent my understanding is this plan is really focused on LSEs that are located within the ISO. How at all does it apply to those that are LSEs but not located inside ISO?
Yeah, I can just start off just to say that, yeah, it's CPUC jurisdictional LSEs. So yeah, that broadly means CAISO, LSE serving CAISO load. There are some LSEs in IRP who also serve other loads.
Well, we've got in the SMJUs entities that are completely outside the ISO and aren't able to operate within that market. And so I'm just trying to figure out if we should just chat with you, outside this workshop, because a lot of the issues, obviously, concerning IRP are really ISO-centric.
Yeah.
Andy, this is Nathan. We'd welcome that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andy. If you could lower your hand. Julia Prosnick, you're unmuted. Julia.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is Julia Prosnick with the Long Duration Energy Storage Association. I really appreciate this presentation. Thank you so much. And Molly, on the table you just showed, will today's information ask for more clarity from all of us on the phone about what information you need from us to help on the development of procurement work?
Yeah, if you're asking, are we going to take comments on this overall proposal and every single nitty-gritty nuance, including, yes.
And will your presentation go into specific asks of what kind of details you need from all of us?
No, I think, as I was saying, I think today's presentation is really about asking clarifying questions for what we put out there, but we haven't yet constructed the list of questions. But you can fairly well assume that at some point you're going to get to comment on all of it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Mary Lynch, good morning. You're unmuted.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mary Lynch with Constellation. Molly, the decision that got issued yesterday on the backstop procurement, there's still another order that's to be forthcoming on the cost recovery issues that's of interest to a number of us, particularly those of us who opted out. Can you give an update on when we'll see that?
I don't have one. I think we should stick to the topic of this proposal, but it's a good question, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. Mary Neal, you are unmuted.
Hi, Mary Neal on behalf of Silicon Valley Clean Energy. You discussed briefly the relevant PU code, and I know the framework references PU code section 454.51D, which gives the CPUC authority to require CCAs to enter long-term contracts with renewable integration resources. So that code also states that the Commission shall permit community choice aggregators to submit proposals for satisfying their portion of the renewable integration need identified. So my question is, does the framework explicitly allow CCAs to submit their own proposals for satisfying renewable integration need? And if so, how?
I think that might be better addressed once we start getting to the relevant sections. Neil, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, no, Mary, we don't go into that detail. I guess IRP, like LSC's individual plans, I think the default venue for that to be put forward.
Right. So I think there's so Mary, there's a lot of the proposal that talks about how we would take information from the LSC submitted plans and use that information in planning. Like, for example, in the section on need determination, how would we use something that the LSCs have already quote unquote planned for, and how would that assess the need determination? And then again, when it talks about the actual procurement and making sure that the procurement is, how would we take procurement that has occurred from a variety of entities and fold that back into our assessments. So it's in there, but not in those exact words. But those are the things to listen for, as especially Karolina, as part of the presentation today.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Mary. Nancy Rader, good morning. You're unmuted.
Good morning, everybody. In terms of foundational principles, I wondered, there's a lot of discussion on the need allocation, but there's no reference to the fact that a bill was passed in 2019, AB 1584, which requires allocation to be done based on causation. And only some of your need allocation proposals are based on causation. So I wondered if you had considered AB 1584.
Hi, Nancy. I think let's pick that up later on the agenda. Yeah, I think that would be a good point for that. Thanks for the question.
Okay.
All right, maybe one more, and then we can move on. I know we've been waiting. Damon Franz, you're unmuted.
Hi, thanks for taking my question, and good morning, everyone. This is Damon Franz from Tesla. I had a question related to Molly's last slide, which indicated that the second tranche of resources, the kind of medium-term resources, would be procured through RPS or the RA program. And this raises a question that has come up quite a bit in these discussions, which is, in the old world that I was in when I worked with Molly at the CPUC, basically the long-term procurement process was the process by which you looked at all of the steel on the ground and determined whether there was a long-term need to sort of build new resources. And you'd build them under long-term contract, and then once they rolled off of those long-term contracts, they'd get picked up in the RA program for the immediate year to 3 year ahead need. And I'm just wondering if that's changing now to where we're looking at the RA program as an additional means to kind of build new resources, and if that assumption is correct, and whether changes need to be made to the RA program to kind of accommodate those resources.
I think Damon, I think that's an excellent active reading of the section of the proposal in section 3.2, where it kind of talks about the weak linkages between IRP and RA. And so what I hear your question say is, do we need to strengthen those linkages? And I think that answer would be yes. Later in the presentation, we're going to talk about compliance and things like that. And so I think that's where, there's probably, more work that needs to be done, both with the RA team and also with input from stakeholders. So we'll be looking to you for your input. Both you, Damon, and all of you stakeholders. Does that help?
Okay. Thank you, Molly. That's a good answer.
Okay, let's move on if we can.
Thank you. Over to Karolina.
All right, thanks everyone. So in this next section, I'll be providing an overview of the guiding principles, criteria, and the procurement process steps. Next slide, David. So the staff proposal covers a wide range of issues and aims to tackle really complex challenges, as Molly said up front. And so to help facilitate a productive process for refining the framework, staff laid out guiding principles that are intended to serve as a foundation, really, especially when it comes to decision points. So the first two principles that we laid out address the fact that the CPUC should aim to provide broad procurement direction where possible and defer to LLCs to determine the specifics for the solicitation, for negotiating, and for the contracts where possible. However, there may be exceptions to this when the CPUC does identify a more specific need.
Sorry, Karolina. There's quite a bit of background noise. Just go on mute, please.
All right, that sounded like a train. All right, so the example is, maybe there's a specific resource type that offers unique benefits and resource diversity. And so this framework is intended to be long-standing, and so this flexibility is important, especially as technologies evolve. Additionally, the structure and design of the CPUC's IRP procurement framework should allow the state to meet its policy goals, existing as well as future goals. It should be transparent. We believe that clarity in terms of what to expect will allow LSEs, developers, and other stakeholders to really best engage in planning and procurement. It should also be repeatable and withstand the test of time and hopefully serve many IRP cycles to come. And this, of course, includes being adaptable as well. The framework should align with the needs of other planning agencies and entities and avoid redundancy or conflict with other programs. And finally, the framework should link planning to procurement. We want to build on the great IRP plans that we get from LSEs, that the LSEs invest their time into developing, and we don't want the procurement framework to undermine that process or disincentivize LSEs from planning. All right, and then based on these guiding principles, staff also established criteria. Next slide. So the criteria can be used for evaluating individual options and also the overall framework. So these include effectiveness and feasibility. So in order for the procurement framework to be effective, staff believes it has to facilitate sufficient, timely, and cost-effective procurement. It should incentivize procurement that is broadly consistent with the optimal portfolio identified by planning. And of course, it should enable California to meet its policy goals. Similarly, the technical and administrative feasibility criteria lean on the guiding principles, and they should be used as a lens to evaluate the likelihood that an agency or entity can implement the option well, given the availability of resources, tools, and data. Next slide. So here we have a schematic that lays out the proposed IRP framework and captures how the procurement process relates to the planning process. And I know this probably appears small on your screen, so you can find the WebEx Zoom function on the left-hand side if you need that. So just to provide an overview of this, on the schematic on the left are steps directly within the purview of the CPUC, and on the right are the steps implemented by LSEs or other procurement entities. This could include, for example, a central procurement entity. So the red items are those that are really the focus of the framework. And all the elements in the downward direction speak to how planning can be actualized into procurement. The upward arrows then link the procurement track back to the planning track. So that's really speaking to that linkage. That's one of the guiding principles. So working from the top to the bottom, the planning process is in the top half, and it focuses on establishing GHG targets and on the development of the reference system plans and the preferred system plans. So this is really what IRP has primarily focused on to date. And these plans, although they do contain resource portfolios and guidance in the form of policy actions, they do not necessarily ensure procurement. So the first step of the procurement track is procurement need determination. So now we're in the bottom half of the schematic. So this is one of the major steps, and it'll be at the focus of the next section. So need determination focuses on questions such as what are the standards for determining what identified need in the planning process actually requires a procurement order. And then the next step is the procurement order itself. So this will be the next large tranche we cover today. And this really covers 3 elements. So the questions it aims to answer include how should the identified procurement need be allocated to specific LSEs? What criteria does the Commission use to determine the appropriate procurement entity? And how should the cost be allocated? And then the final tranche will include 3 elements. So the first will be what approval process should be used for the future procurement in IRP. So that's the next box below. And so the CPUC approves IOU procurement, but CCA procurement gets approved by their boards, which is why it's on the right side of the diagram. And the next box is compliance, monitoring, and enforcement. And the objective here is to have a clear process to know if LSEs are on track to meet the identified needs and to determine if any corrective action is required. And finally is the question of how procurement orders should be considered in future planning. And so that is the linkage back to the GHG planning target and the policy goals. And, you know, in this schematic, we have it flowing from the compliance monitoring box. But, you know, one of the main questions that we really aim to answer there is at what point does it flow back into, for example, reference system plan development? Does it go maybe directly from the procurement order box instead? What is the best fit? When can it be determined to be certain? So I think I'll end there and open it up to questions.
I'm looking for raised hands. And I do see David Smith. You are unmuted.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having the workshop and for preparing the document. And I understand the purpose of the previous graphic, the schematic, was to show the relationship between the LSEs and the IRP process. And one of the things I had noted in reading the paper that there was a number of issues that really tied to either the transmission investment decision process, where that fits into the planning process, and how, you know, decisions are made to go ahead and invest. the way I see the IRP is it should be informing both transmission investments, any other common investments, plus procurement. I see those activities, investment, common investment, and specific procurement as being part of the execution from these plans. And I just wanted to understand better how the transmission, how LSEs are interacting with the transmission appropriately, or is that all through the CPUC IRP?
You're breaking out just there, the last sentence, David.
No, I just wanted to understand how the LSEs work with the transmission process, and is that through the CPUC, or are they working directly with them? Or how is the the LSEs working, forming the transmission investment common process?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So this is certainly, one of the elements that staff raised in the staff proposal. And I think it is a complex one. The way, some of the questions that we raise is basically the fact that you do want to ensure that alignment. You don't want stranded transmission investments. You don't want stranded resource investments. So they really do have to go hand in hand, which is, I'll get to this in the last section, but in part, like why when really going to that linkage of, what procurement orders should inform reference system plan baseline versus what should be up for reevaluation. We propose a category there that does actually include the question of, well, does the procurement order potentially point any resources that would require transmission development? Because if they do, and if we're moving forward with that transmission development process by potentially transmitting resource portfolios to CAISO TPP process, and those if TPP process results in approval of transmission, then we want to ensure that those resources show up where the transmission is being developed to accommodate them. So those are certainly issues that still need to be worked out, but they are in consideration here. In terms of I think LSE's role in and the transmission development element, I think LSEs, it really depends. It depends on the project, whether maybe it's with both the resource and the transmission costs being covered there. It depends whether the developer, whether you're seeking to socialize the cost of the transmission. So it depends on the specific situation. I don't know, Molly or Nathan or if others have anything to add on the interaction between the LSEs specifically.
Karolina, Nathan, I think that you got it there. I would just say, in kind of a more simple sense, we work with LSEs and LSEs work with us over the course of an IRP planning cycle to produce portfolios that do go to CAISO's transmission planning process. And if you're asking more specifically about how they interact once those things are at TPP, I'd kind of defer to CAISO and the LSEs on that. But hopefully Karolina's answer helped.
And one other thing, sorry, I just remembered. We do specifically ask in the IRP LSE filing requirements that LSEs do highlight if they will need new transmission for any of their resources, and to justify that transmission to kind of, help ensure that is like an intended consequence rather than the resources triggering something unintentionally. So I think that's an element of the LSE plan. So we haven't seen that yet in any of the plans, I think, submitted to date, the need to trigger transmission, but something that will probably come up more over the years. All right.
Thanks, David. Deb Emerson, good morning. You're unmuted.
Morning. Thank you, Karolina, so much for going over the schematic. And I had a question about the bottom of that slide where it mentions compliance monitoring and enforcement. And I'm hoping you could tell us specifically what that entails.
I can and I will, but probably in about an hour. We have a section focused on that later in the workshop.
All right, thank you very much.
Of course.
John Wilson, you're unmuted.
Hi, thank you. John Wilson, representing consultants of the Small Business Utility Association.
John, can you get a little closer to the mic?
Yes, I sure can. Let me see if I'm online. Is that better?
Much better.
Great, thanks. Representing the Small Business Utility Association. And my question is, or it's really kind of a suggestion. I think it would be helpful to have a schematic that lays out the status quo, so to speak, with all its messiness. And for example, right now in the emergency reliability proceeding, there's some discussion of potential procurement there. And so that's almost like an alternate route to the procurement need determination that's outside of this process. And it would be good in a way to sort of think through what are the existing paths to procurement need determination that don't fit into this relatively simple schematic. And another one that's not on here is CAISO's capacity procurement mechanism. So, you know, I think thinking about that would be helpful. I mean, I know that you said that one of the principles of your paper is non-interference effectively in other state agencies' processes, sort of adapting to them. But, you know, a question might be really, should there be changes in the way CAISO does things? And I'm not proposing any right here. I'm just sort of saying, you know, maybe we shouldn't be just thinking of CPUC processes here.
That's an excellent, yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say, excellent suggestion. Yeah, thank you for the points. And, you know, one of the concepts or terms that we use in the paper is non-routine versus routine need and procurement. And I think that's partially what you're getting at, is just understanding all of the different routes for which procurement may happen, so that we understand what is really incremental to that. Go ahead, Molly.
Yeah, and I mean, we do mention on page 24 the FERC backstop procurement authority, or the FERC tariff that CAISO derives its backstop procurement authority from. And you know, your question really touches my heart, because as I was preparing my slides about the problems in the existing landscape, I thought, wow, how would I do a diagram of what it is today? Because exactly when you try to do a diagram of what it should be, you know, it is nicer to start with one. So if, you know, I would say we don't frequently request stakeholders submit us drawings in their comments, but if people have other schematics that they think that would be helpful for all of us to understand, let's submit them formally or informally. Let's move on. Thanks.
Well, just very briefly, I think one of the things that would be helpful from that is, in a way, to identify the solution. You kind of need to understand what we've been doing to, you know, sort of work around the existing system and solve problems when the existing system isn't working. And so I think the discussion in the emergency reliability proceeding is a good one that is instructive to sort of, how would you design a system that doesn't need an emergency reliability proceeding? So, and you know, there's probably other examples of other instances in a variety of proceedings where exceptions to the sort of theoretical procurement process have been, you know, considered to be appropriate.
Correct. At least energy storage comes to mind. But let's move on.
All right, there may be a few more hands, but we'll try to get to them later on. Let's try to keep moving.
Thanks, David. On to need determination. Okay. Right, so first step in the process as we define it is need determination. And that means how do we actually identify what should be procured to meet a planning requirement? As distinct from what's found in the planning track, you know, new resources to be optimal. This is about what CPC procurement action might be needed. Okay, so a simple generic chart here just to set the scene. It's generic. It's generic in the sense it could be talking about reliability or GHG or some other driver for procurement. But the line here is indicating what the requirement is in each year in the future. There are some baseline resources which help meet it. There's some planned resources that help meet it, and there may be a gap. That gap we're roughly defining as the procurement need. So next slide, thanks, David. That graphic, probably a bit too simplistically, showed 2030 as the example where there's a procurement need. But as the staff proposal explores, that might not be appropriate for the CPC to take action for now, for example, for 2030 needs. So like although that may show up in the planning track, procurement action may not be needed as urgently. So this goes to the routine versus non-routine concept that Karolina mentioned there and is explained in section 3.2. So just, we talked a bit about routine. Non-routine would be where a procurement order is needed because the resources are long lead time in nature, complex. There are some other sort of barriers or externalities in markets to bringing them online with existing programs and markets. Or if routine resources, the need for them becomes urgent due to delays or issues in them being procured in the ordinary course of LSE business. This slide also just calls out the distinction between planned and baseline resources. It's a similar concept as we got in the planning track, and essentially baseline resources in a procurement sense are highly certain, either because they're already online or they're contracted to be online. So this distinction is significant and explored more in the proposal. So next slide, thanks, David. More on the issues associated with need determination as background here. We've broken up sort of three broad buckets of drivers for procurement need: reliability driven procurement, GHG reduction driven procurement, and then an admittedly broad and unclear sort of other bucket. Just recognizing that there may be the need for procurement action which may not be neatly driven by the other two categories. So we think of things like the need to integrate renewables, aiming for resiliency in the grid, and some combination of these things. On slide 24, I think, like Karolina laid out guiding principles, and we do have specificity of need as an issue in procurement need determination. The guiding principle is that procurement need should be expressed in as broad a terms as possible, so defined by the attributes and the services that are needed, not specific technologies or resources. That's the general principle, but the possible reasons to deviate from that are listed here. Larger long lead time resources, more on that later as we talk through various options. Transmission development, that was well covered by Karolina in responding to David Smith's question earlier, so I won't repeat that. And then resource diversity. So the idea here would be if the state's resource portfolio is becoming heavily skewed to just a few resource types, the CPUC may seek to increase the diversity of resource types in the portfolio to help mitigate risk of over-reliance on any small handful of resource types. And then, also part of this is the qualitative benefits that may be associated with procuring relatively untested resource types. If we look to 2045 and the range of potential new technologies that might be needed to meet state objectives. Okay, so they're the background issues and need determination. Now diving into some of the options that are laid out in the staff proposal. We're going to run through quite a few of these across all the topic areas, and so just orient stakeholders. options are not necessarily alternatives to each other. In many cases, they're complementary. These two are an example, just in general, need determination. When should need determination be conducted? It's potentially a very resource-intensive exercise to do. So it's important to think about when to do it. Option one here is on some regular set schedule, either in conjunction with the calendar or stage of the IRP process. Option two is having need determination conducted when particular events occur. So it's sort of triggers for a need determination to take place. And the proposal lays out what those could be with some ideas there. So then the next slide moves into reliability need determination in particular. So if we're trying to determine procurement need that's driven by reliability, 5 options are laid out. I'll skip through the next slide, which puts 4 of them side by side. So, okay, so option one here is essentially drawing straight from the planning track findings of the reference system portfolio or the preferred system portfolio, depending where we're at in the planning track, and then assessing how to expected resources in the future based on the baseline and LSE's plans compared to the optimal portfolio, and what's the delta, and identifying procurement need from that delta. Option 2, this is a method that was used last year in the November procurement order. This looked at the forecast load, added the planning reserve margin, and then looked at expected resources to be online in those future years, and applied the effective load carrying capacities assumed in the RA program for those resource types at the time of the procurement order. And the delta between those was the need that was determined. Option 3 here builds on that. It's similar in concept, but it would involve updating the planning reserve margin to ensure that it's expected to result in a loss of load expectation no higher than the standard of 0.1. It would also build on option 2 by projecting what effective load carrying capacities for each resource type would be in future years, based on the changing resource mix and as loads expected to change in future. And it would do this by leveraging the work that the reference system portfolio modeling already does on those concepts. And then option 4, again, builds further on that one by rather than sort of relying on that modeling from the reference system portfolio effort, it would involve running new loss of load expectation modeling by production cost modeling to update effective load carrying capacities. Option 5 is not shown here. It's a bit of a different, it doesn't quite fit into this paradigm. It's detailed in the proposal, but essentially it breaks down the problems that these options here are trying to get back with 3 resource sufficiency checks, which are detailed in the proposal and reference to the work and thinking on that topic in the RA proceeding. Okay, then switching to GHG need determination options, we lay out 2 in the proposal. Option 1 is that rather than taking the 2030 GHG benchmark for each LSE, we determine annual GHG limits for each LSE that puts the state on the trajectory to meet the 2030 objectives. And the emissions from their portfolios are estimated against those annual requirements, and deviations drive what need for new resources to reduce GHG there may be. Option 2 is broader. It goes beyond GHG to also look at criteria air pollutant reduction policy goals. So two reasonably broad concepts put there as far as options. And then on the next slide, we go into long lead time resource options. So this is where, this larger long lead time resources may be where we deviate from the general principle of not being resource specific. And so two options suggested here. One is to use sensitivity analysis to determine the value that larger long lead time resources can add. The proceeding and the staff proposal details the resource types, and Molly referred to them earlier in that table. But essentially this analysis would try and identify resources that are unlikely to be procured by LSEs, individual LSEs, or maybe even collectively, but they may still hold value to the system. Option two sort of builds on that by just acknowledging that there ought to be, it identifies that there ought to be an approach that's clear about how to determine what resource types should be considered in that assessment. Now, the planning track has an approach for doing that. There's an inputs and assumption process with lots of stakeholder engagement. And then, so for procurement, that could be sufficient, but there may be exceptional circumstances where procurement would need to have more up-to-date information on that, and the planning track may not be at that part of the cycle. Okay, so then just to conclude the need determination range of options, on the next slide, we've got 5 what we're calling enabling actions, in the sense that, we didn't call them options because they sort of appear necessary and feasible to implement almost regardless of the path forward. I'll just quickly run through these. So action 1 here would be, if you think back to the original bar chart I presented for need determination, when you look at resources that are not yet online, applying viability factors to those, much like we do in the capacity expansion modeling and the planning track. But unlike capacity expansion modeling, where we don't include planned resources, i.e. those are not contracted, viability factors would be applied to those for procurement need determination purposes. Action number 2 here is to help understand when procurement action might be required by developing, what the lead times are for particular resource types. And then action 3 is developing a stronger linkage, like Karolina indicated, between the planning track and the procurement track, so that LSEs can prepare their plans with a knowledge of how the procurement track would take those into account. 4, clearly IRP and RA programs are very important to one another, and there are a set of assumptions we list in the staff proposal, where about 6 or so which are really key to help improve alignment between the 2 proceedings. And then finally, 5, thinking back to the transmission discussion earlier, this action would involve, given that the CPUC plays a role in approving transmission projects from a permitting perspective later in the development process, this action here would involve setting up a sort of a pre-assessment that occurs earlier on, so that the procurement process in IRP has already some of those permitting risks factored in before proceeding with resource-related procurement that leads to transmission procurement. Okay, so that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of that section in the staff proposal on need determination. We've got about, I think, 5 to 10 minutes to cover some questions on need determination in particular.
Okay, I see a hand raised from Scott Olson. Scott, you are unmuted.
Great, thank you. Hi, Neil. It's Scott Olson with Direct Energy. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the new proposed greenhouse gas compliance mechanism within the paper. It talks about setting annual limits, but then it also talks about having some flexibility for LSEs to comply. So my first question is, do you foresee sort of a compliance period, a multi-year obligation requirement, kind of like what happens with RPS? And my second question on this is that there's always been a disconnect between how the IRP assesses an LSE's greenhouse gas emissions and how the ARB assesses the emissions. And when this has been brought up to the proceeding, the answer has always been, well, there's a difference between compliance, which is ARB, and planning, which is this process. If this is becoming more of a compliance requirement, would there be consideration for refinement of the greenhouse gas analysis approach so it does now align with the ARB approach? Thanks.
Excellent question, Scott. So to answer your first question, so there are two options that are laid out. And the first option was the LSE specific annual GHG limits, which as constructed right now, that idea is to be annual. The other one is a kind of as an alternative was the Clean Resource Standard, and that one, as designed in the framework, is more to reflect the RPS sort of compliance period concept, and that is to allow for more of that flexibility. Especially, you know, considering that loads may change. There may be variation loads for LSEs and different circumstances. Of course, that same concept can still apply to the first option.
Right.
Maybe there's a way to refine it to also make it similarly a compliance period. I think the purpose with laying out the options in the manner that they are laid out here was to kind of create two alternatives, see in comments what parties have to say about the two so that we can ultimately hopefully land on one. And I'm sure whatever we land on will, you know, be a refinement of these, maybe a combination. And I think there's still a long way to go on this specific issue, since most procurement need or any need to date has been more reliability focused. And then to your second question regarding assessing emissions, yes, I think that is one of the you know, challenges we ran into when sort of constructing these in the framework, is this question of, well, if you know, if we put these in place, we will need to monitor them, and how will that look exactly? I think there are a couple of ideas in there, but you raise an important question, and I think that's something that would have to be explored further. And we welcome ideas when it is time for comments.
Great, thank you.
I would just also add that from a problem perspective, I mean, the first two cycles of IRP, you know, were largely conducted prior to SB 100's impact really being understood. So in the first cycle of IRP, when we look towards the GHG planning standard, the GHG constraint was not the binding constraint that was driving procurement. But as we look to an SB 100 future, the GHG constraint will become a binding constraint that drives procurement. So it has to become an enforceable part of the compliance regimen and an enforceable part of the need determination.
Thanks, Molly. I think Sandeep has a question. You're unmuted.
Yeah, hi guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
David? Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, this is Sandeep Arora with LS Power. Thanks for the presentation, Karolina. and team. My question has to do with, I guess, kind of just a follow up to the question that Dave Smith was asking earlier on transmission. And the question has to do with there appears to be a gap between what PUC and CAISO TPP processes have been addressing with respect to the transmission need, and in particular, out-of-state transmission. I heard your response, Karolina, where I think what you were alluding to is, look, if LSCs are seeing the need for resources and that drives the need for new transmission, then that eventually shows up in the IRP and TPP processes. Oftentimes, what we are seeing is there are LSCs in California that they do want to contract with out-of-state resources, such as diverse resource in Idaho, a wind resource in Idaho, but they're not certain that there will be transmission available to get those resources delivered to California. So kind of chicken and egg situation there. So they don't end up, saying anything about those resources in their filings. Now PUC generates a portfolio goes to CAISO. CAISO performs their transmission planning studies, which ends up making a determination on transmission investment needs and so on. But again, another gap in the process is CAISO will only look at delivery points to their boundary substations. So say even if there was a 2,000 megawatt portfolio coming in from Idaho, CAISO will model it as a 2,000 megawatt injection at El Dorado substation, essentially trying to figure out the impacts that it has on downstream transmission system and trying to figure out if there's any transmission needed there. So again, there is a gap. How do you, LSCs want some certainty that there will be transmission so they can access these diverse resources from out of state. Two, CAISO TPP process, and PUC IRP process should start analyzing what out-of-state transmission options exist and what might make the most sense to be able to deliver that product into California. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on how to close that gap going forward.
Sandeep, I'm just going to pause before you respond, Karolina. Thanks for all of that. I am worried that we're already veering into the advocacy portion of the Q&A that we were trying to limit to just clarifying questions. We'll take a stab at that. It might be a little bit outside of the scope of the proposal that we're looking at. Karolina, if you have thoughts, by all means.
I have lots of thoughts, but trying to think if I could summarize them in 1 minute. Sandeep, I will say, I think I hear you loud and clear. You're absolutely right that right now the portfolios, transmitted to CAISO would potentially lead to approval of CAISO transmission system upgrades that may be one step towards accessing the out-of-state resources. But there is this gap in how to ensure the out-of-state transmission portion is covered and whether, whether that cost, people are seeking to socialize it, or again, it kind of goes back to my previous response, whether it becomes part of a PPA because it is cost effective as in kind of all in cost of resource and transmission. But we are certainly doing work on this. And we had that assessment earlier in the year on out-of-state resources and transmission, and this is something we, plan to further tackle in the next IRP cycle. And we kind of noted it in the staff proposal, even in terms of there's a sort of CEQA pre-assessment idea for in-state transmission. Well, what would be a similar, is there something similar that we should be considering for out-of-state transmission and resources? So it's something that we definitely have top of mind. I can't say I have a solution just yet, but you will be one of the first to know if I do.
I just quick add on to what Karolina said. I mean, I think that this process, this IRP procurement framework is, a key bridge to helping the CPUC be able to take action if warranted to support out-of-state transmission. It's probably not the only thing we need to do. There's a lot of things going on, but this one is, we definitely understand that problem. And I do think that it is possible for the IRP process to trigger out-of-state transmission, and this framework helps, create that, create the foundation for that to actually work on behalf of all benefiting customers.
Thanks, Sandeep. Mohit, you're unmuted.
Well, good morning, Mohit from NRDC. My question is, Molly clearly stated how the GHG is becoming the binding constraint for procurement. And the paper also talks about how RPS compliance and GHGs don't have a one-to-one relationship. And mean procurement of clean energy does happen through RPS. So I'm wondering if staff thinks that the IRP results, RSP, PSP will have a more active role in driving what gets procured for RPS compliance, or are you thinking you'll set the GHG goals and that LSEs figure it out? And if it's already in the paper, please just point me to it. Thank you so much.
I don't believe the answer is in the paper, and I'm not sure it's in my head either. Others?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say, Mohit, I think that the issue you raised is recognized in the paper, that RPS compliance may not necessarily lead to meeting GHG goals of the state, because they're not one for one. And yeah, so I think in due course, we really would value stakeholder input on that.
Yeah, and that disconnect gets larger as you start doing more long-term planning at higher, renewable penetration levels. What's good for long-term GHG goals isn't the same as least cost compliance. Thank you so much.
Let me try one or two more. And a reminder, if you've raised your hand, and please drop your hand unless you have a new question, which I hope we can get to. Ellen Wolf, good morning. You're unmuted.
Good morning. It's Ellen Wolf from Missouri Consulting. Can you hear me okay? Okay, yes. Thanks. First, thanks for I thought it was an excellent paper. And in particular, I was really impressed at you articulating some of the sticky problems that I think are at the crux of why things feel a little bit stuck in getting from, the great solutions you're finding in IRP and actually affecting outcomes on the grid that have the reliability and GHG impacts that you're looking for. So I was really impressed by that. And now the heavy lift comes with just figuring out how to fix it all. But the one thing I noticed is you articulated, I think it was section 6.3, this issue about how LSCs might want certain resources. And with the kind of carbon goals we're contemplating, it's likely that we're going to exhaust the available transmission system or the available transmission capacity on the system. And I don't know if you were thinking just the big stuff or also the little stuff, but I think it does apply to the little stuff. And I've listened to these discussions you've had with Dave Smith and Sandeep about the big transmission projects. But what I'm wondering about is it seems like it's more of a problem than just long lead time resources or new technology resources. It has to do with many types of resources. And one of the attributes you pointed to was this quality in the LSC plan where the LSCs are supposed to mention if their projects warrant transmission. But I don't think they'll always know that. I think that's part of the job of the ISO and in coordinating with you guys about whether the collective plans require transmission. And so I'm wondering where in the framework as you go forward, will you look at this issue of transmission that ends up needing to be built based on the LSC procurement preferences or the IRP portfolios, but then isn't really getting built. It seems like there's some sort of impasse going on there that you identified where then even from year to year, LSC plans change because the projects they may have wanted to procure don't get procured because those projects drop out of the queue, end up being too expensive or something. And so is there a place in the framework for projects like that that may not be long lead time per se, and they may not be particularly unique? Will what you do find solutions that apply for those as well?
Ellen, one thing that comes to mind, for example, in the monitoring options, the purpose of monitoring is to assess, to determine, are our LSEs on track, and what are the trends maybe to why procurement isn't matching the planning, right? And so I think that is one place where this would fit is, it doesn't necessarily have to be a long lead time resource. The idea here is to understand all of the barriers to procuring resources and, address them the best we can. And so, like you said, maybe LSEs aren't aware of what transmission would be required, or maybe they are, but either way, it's not translating, to it actually occurring. So I would say when it's time for comments, we absolutely would love to hear your ideas in how those pieces can better account for the specific problem that you are describing.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and it's a little bit tricky because I know this is a primarily procurement-focused initiative, and I just yesterday was reading again the GridWorks report on process improvements that has all sorts of stuff about better coordination with agencies, and of course those things all get jumbled up in my mind. They all seem like great ideas. It's not clear that the solution is to force the procurement that the LSEs expressed, a year earlier or something, or to penalize them if they didn't end up buying those resources if the ISO is really where the coordination needs to happen. So it's really tricky, but I'm really also very appreciative that you're tackling all these things at the same time, because hopefully it'll sort itself out. So thank you.
Thanks, Ellen.
Okay, I think let me just check. Mary Lynch, is your hand still up, or do you have a new question?
Yeah, my hand is up. I had some questions from before, but on this module, I think it's related to this discussion we've been having, but I really wasn't understanding what happens under Action 5 in that previous slide with respect to a pre-assessment. I don't know if that's applicable to LSEs or developers or the Cal ISO, or what is that step all about?
Short answer, because I think we're a little behind on time here, is that it's more of an internal step, and this is why it's an action. It's because it's something I think the CPUC believes should occur and can occur. It's internal coordination so that, for example, the IRP does not send portfolios to CAISO that exceed known transmission limits, therefore kind of pointing for necessary transmission based on the resource needs. And then also the CPUC CEQA process, when when that transmission approval or environmental assessment gets there, then says, well, we don't see a need for this. So it's just to kind of prevent some circumstances that have probably come up over the past decade or so, and just to ensure more internal coordination.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we got a few more, but let's try to catch them at the end, and let's move on.
Thanks, David. All right, now we move on to a group of topics which we sort of see as part of ordering procurement. So once the needs determination, firstly, need allocation. How does that need? Sorry, David, do you mind? Thanks. Sorry, I think there's still some background noise. Great. Yeah, so once that need determination is how is the allocation of responsibility made to LSEs for addressing the need? That may be distinct from who actually does the procuring and how costs are allocated. So just we break those parts of the process down into these three. So firstly, on need allocation, I think to Nancy Radar's earlier question, the proposal basically assumes a principle of cause or pays. I think Nancy's been referring to a bill that was passed in the last year or two, which makes that required. So perhaps, yeah, the proposal initially poses as a question, is that appropriate? Are there other principles that should be used? But in the options we explore, they pretty much are based on cause or pays principle. Other issues involved in need allocation listed here. When you think of, with respect to each LSE's position, how do you count existing resources? And how do you know what resources are incremental to what's already underway for procurement, and what would count to a new procurement requirement? Of course, uncertainty of load in the future is important in many areas of our industry, including when allocating need. That goes to the cause or pays concept, that the customer's load size is some indication of its cause for a need for procurement. A complex issue is associated with need allocation is also the potential for stranded costs, particularly as things change quickly, and how do you address that equitably? And then there's a similar load risk management, which is business as usual for retailing electric service provision. So what's the distinction there? And we note the power charging difference amount PCIA topic is interrelated here, and also potentially changing. So then we go into some of the options available. Next slide, thanks, Evan. And just in general for need allocation, these options here are presented to sort of indicate the hierarchy. I think the proposal wasn't so clear about that. So just hopefully this table does help. Essentially 4 general options. Option 1 is that need allocation to LSEs follows the need determination step. So in the order we've been discussing it so far. And a corollary of that is that you only allocate need to LSEs if there is a system need or aggregate need determined in the need determination step. And then within that approach, how do you allocate the need if there does exist one? Option 2, you take into account the LSE's portfolio positions as well as their load share. Option 3, you base it just on the load share. And then, so option 4 is just back a step back up. If in contrast to option 1, what if the need allocation could be part of the need determination? So that may result in LSEs being allocated procurement need, even if there isn't a procurement need determined at the aggregate level. You could think of the RA program operating in this way. And so then option 2, which I described before, could be a way to prorate that aggregate requirement to LSEs. There may be other ways, but I hope that hierarchy helps. And then if we move into slide 35, it has a couple of simple examples just to help illustrate this. So starting with option 3, which is more simple, just allocating on the basis of LSE load shares. The columns here indicate the aggregate sort of system or total level, and then for example LSEs, the requirement row, this is generic, so these, just consider these just general units. If in aggregate 5,000 units are required, they're allocated by load share to the LSEs as shown in this example, with LSEA having the highest requirement based on it having the highest share of load. And then at the aggregate level, the position or the expected future resources are found to be 4,000 units, so there's a need of 1,000. How do we allocate those to LSEs? It's prorated based on their requirement, which is driven by the load share. And then option 2 is more complex because it would build in consideration of each LSE's position. So in that position row in the second table, that just gives examples of how the LSE's positions may differ to one another and also differ to their requirement. And then the final column indicates a none. So there may be some resources which are not contracted by any LSE, but that do get factored into when assessing need determination at the aggregate level. And then the need allocation that falls out from this basically results in 2 LSEs being allocated need in proportion to what their contribution was to the shortness in the system. So LSE C's got 2/5 of the total short positions of the short LSEs. That leads to them getting 2/5 of the need. These are simplistic and just hopefully help illustrate the broad concepts that sit behind the options in the proposal. Okay, so then the next set of slides go into, well, this slide now takes that generic options and applies some specific ways to actually implement those concepts. So that they're in bold here, just in the context of those general options. Number one, starting with that, it's in the middle there, but that's the simplest. It's allocating, so system, this is tailored for system reliability need, and it would be allocating it using the approach used for the November 2019 decision, which was load share based. Option 2, at the top there, that's allocating it similar to November decision, but also bringing into consideration LSE's portfolio positions. Option 3 is listed in both of the broad general approaches. This is in reference to one of the need determination approaches that are listed in the earlier section of the report, where energy and capacity-based analysis are conducted. Those can be done at the aggregate level, and here they could be done at the LSE level too, and could be done in a way to have that as part of need allocation following need determination, or simultaneously. And then option 4 here is a GHG reduction specific option, and it directly sort of falls out from the need determination approach we discussed earlier with the annual limits, which are inherently LSE based, and so therefore when you allocate need to LSEs, that could fall out straight from that approach. Okay, so that's need allocation. Onto the next part of a procurement order, which would be associated with which entities should conduct the procurement, and which entities should operate the resources that result from that procurement. They may be different. And just highlighting again that the procurement entities may be distinct from the LSEs allocated the need, just described in the prior section. Okay, so I'll skip through slides 38 and 39 because I think they're addressed in the options we look at here. So slide 40 specifically addresses, well, what happens if we have exceptional circumstances of large or long lead time resources needing procurement for the reasons we've discussed before, but for some reason they're not able to be procured by LSEs individually or collectively. What procurement entity or entities should be doing that procurement? And so option 1 is that you would have central procurement entities appointed as front stop procurement entities for that. Option 2 is that LSEs are given the opportunity to conduct that procurement themselves first. If they fail, then one or more central procurement entities would be appointed to conduct backstop procurement. And then the next slide explores options associated with the question of self-provision. Option 1 is that all LSEs, non-IAUs can opt out of self-providing for the need that's allocated to them. That was the case for the November 2019 decision. Whereas option 2 is that all LSEs that are allocated need must self-provide. So that would that would be different from option 1 in that the CCAs and ESPs that are allocated to procurement need would be required to self-provide. Moving on to other types of options. Next slide, thanks, Ode. Okay, so these address if there is a role for a central procurement entity or multiple central procurement entities. There are 4 options associated with this one. Option 1 is the IOUs, the central procurement entities, if those are required, meaning that if LSEs opt out, if they're given that option and they opt out of self-providing, the IOUs would do it, or if LSEs self-provide but then fail and there's a need for backstop, the IOUs will do it. Option 2 here is appoint a non-LSE central procurement entity that could be either existing or new private or state organizations. Option 3 on the next slide. And these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. This raises the idea that all LSEs could apply to be a central procurement entity. And then the CPUC would grant that entity conditional approval to go ahead and procure, knowing that they can get cost recovery for a particular procurement effort. And there's the concept of it being for mutually beneficial procurement. The 4th option here is really just to build on that with developing clear criteria on what resources, again, back to the routine versus non-routine resource procurement concept, and then developing the criteria for the process of a designated central procurement entity being able to proceed with contracting and then gaining cost recovery similar to the CAM approach. Okay, I think that's enough on procurement entities. Actually, one more point on the next slide is, what requirements would be associated with being a procurement entity, or should there be any? Option 1 is no. Option 2 is minimum standards are developed to establish what entities can be central procurement entities. Not just central procurement entities, but procurement entities full stop. Okay, and then on to operating entity considerations. Two simple options here. So this is again in instances where resources there's a need for a central procurement entity to conduct the procurement. Should they be required to consider other LLCs' interests when establishing the operating arrangements? These are not new issues. These have come about in the past central procurement efforts over the years. They're complex to work through, and we just lay two broad approaches here. Okay, I think that's it on procurement and operating entities. And if we now switch to cost allocation. Okay, so as mentioned, cost allocation is closely related to the 2 prior topics, because the need to allocate costs only arises if the entity doing the procuring is different from the customers that are responsible for that procurement need, so those that are being allocated the need. So important background here is the cost allocation mechanism, commonly known as the CAM, which was developed during LTDP days and has been applied a number of times to develop new generation for reliability needs. That's an important background and concept available here. And essentially that's been used when IOUs are procuring on behalf of all customers in their territory. The staff proposal doesn't go into much detail on cost allocation. We had the earlier question about what's the status of the live topic in IRP on cost allocation. The November 2019 decision requires cost allocation arrangements to be developed. So the staff proposal doesn't attempt to repeat or extend the considerations going on in that. So if we go to the next slide, the options are really simple, and just to keep the dialogue going is just to identify that, well, the CAM can be used when a central procurement entity is directed to procure. The alternative is to use the modified cost allocation mechanism, which is what's called for by the November 2019 decision. And so the point here is that option 2 and that November 2019 decision is trying to deal with the nuances that the CAM can't necessarily be used because we've got CCAs and ESPs, some of them self-providing, and we've also got the potential for backstop procurement to be required, and so cost allocation, we need to deal with both of those situations. And so just to conclude on cost allocation, the proposal also calls out an enabling action on this, whereby just recognizing that there have been a range of issues and challenges identified in need allocation and procurement entity direction. And so there's more to be done on exploring options to manage the cost allocation implications of those. Okay, so I'll leave that at that, and just ask if there are any questions on those three interrelated topics.
Damon, you have your hand up. You have a new question, or go ahead. You're unmuted.
Oh, I apologize. I might have hit that button accidentally.
That's quite okay. So Scott Olson again. You're unmuted, Scott.
Great, thanks. Scott Olson with Direct Energy. So, I have a question on the procurement need allocation, the option 1 versus option 4. Just interested in some of what the commission's thinking was specifically for option 4. I certainly understand when procurement was called last year, the commission recognized that there was a gap between the RA proceeding, which system RA is only looking 1 year in advance, versus IRP procurement, which is looking farther in advance. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Option 4 now is kind of going another step further and saying, even if the commission does not recognize an aggregate need, it still might assign procurement to individual LSEs. Individual LSE obligations certainly are handled by the RA proceeding, are handled by RPS, or handled by greenhouse gas filings with the ARB. Are there some shortfalls with those individual procurement requirements through those proceedings that you feel exist, which might lead to this option 4 being proposed? And if that didn't make sense, I'm happy to elaborate. Sorry.
No, sorry. It had to be a first mute incident. And thanks, it was me. No, it's a good question. David, perhaps you could go back to slide 34. I think it would just help walk through this a little bit. I think, like in a nutshell, I think, Scott, you're asking a question that is pretty foundational here, and the proposal doesn't have the answers. But I think, just to elaborate, this wasn't the commission's thinking, but staff's thinking in option 4 was, to get it. I guess what you're probably referring to is that, like, a compliance program could use an option 4 approach, like the RA program does, and might that be applicable in longer term planning and procurement? So I note that IRP doesn't have a compliance program with respect to procurement progress at this stage. And so I think that's where this option would go to. Not to say the other options don't lead to compliance requirements, which we'll come to in a later section. So I just want to acknowledge that that question's at the heart of this type of thinking. You know, the RA program is 1 year ahead for system, 3 years out for local. I think roughly half of local resources also contribute to systems. Arguably, there are compliance requirements 3 years out for RA at the system level. And how does that get us to the planning horizon and the procurement needs that IRP is contemplating? Is there a gap? I think that's what the proposal is trying to set up, and I'm glad you called that out. And so yeah, we look forward to getting ideas on that in due course.
Thanks, Neil. Let's try Christian Lambert. You're unmuted.
Hi, this is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocates. Thank you all for this robust presentation. I have a clarifying question. Could you explain a little bit more about the option for LSEs to apply to be a central procurement entity? Specifically, what would that process actually look like? What is the venue that it comes before the commission, and what is the timing of that with respect to, say, an actual solicitation?
Yeah, I think others may have some ideas, but I think, Christian, you're getting to details that would need to be worked through. So the staff proposal doesn't go into that. They're both important considerations for sure.
I think I could chime in and say that on the transmission side of the house, I think we might have some kind of model for how this could go forward. So right now we have a situation where we have three, incumbent participating transmission owners, the three big IOUs at the CAISO, and then through competitive solicitation process at the CAISO has identified competitive transmission providers who have been selected to become transmission owners. Those transmission owners have to apply to the CPUC. They submit an application for a CPCN, a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, and that in that CPCN kind of grants them the right to be, don't quote me on this in terms of like legal parlance, but essentially become like a utility rating. And then with the CPCN, they can go and apply to FERC for cost recovery. So they're not, in the instance of transmission, they don't need to come to the CPUC for cost recovery, but they do need to come to us for a permit to construct their facilities. And gives them things like eminent domain authority. So that's on the transmission side. And so there could be some type of parallel process whereby a new entity could apply to the CPUC, probably for a CPCN, and then they could be, the purpose of that entity could be to own and operate a particular facility or multiple facilities, and it could be, again, on behalf of one or more LSEs. So that's, I think that, does that help? Hopefully that helps your question there. I'm not sure if there are other questions we should move to.
Thanks, Molly. Mary Neal, do you have a new question? You're unmuted.
Yes, I do. So for the phase one procurement that could be used for procurement to replace Diablo Canyon, when determining need allocation under the recommended framework, will past LSE procurement of other baseload resources such as geothermal be considered? I think the answer is no, but I wanted to ask.
Hi, Mary. I'm just going to, I think you're referring to phase one recommendations in the need allocation section. I'm just going to turn to those just to check the detail there, and perhaps I can come back to you either at the end of this Q&A or at the end of this workshop. So could we just take another action in the meantime?
That'd be great.
Okay, I think that's all for now. Let's try to move on.
All right, so I think we can start the next section. David, do you want to go to the next slide? All right, so in this next section, I'll be speaking to a few elements, approval, monitoring and enforcement, and also the link back to the planning process. So beginning with approval, the issues at hand here include what is the appropriate process by which IOUs and potential central procurement entities should have their resource procurement approved to ensure cost recovery from ratepayers. Also the question of how can the approval process balance expediency of procurement with the need for stakeholder review and the possibility of that review finding significant deficiencies. And finally, the trade-off between having standardized CPUC approval criteria defined up front versus ensuring that the approval process is fit for each instance of procurement. All right, so we have 3 options that we laid out in the framework. The first approval option is to rely on the CPUC's existing requirements, including applications for contracts longer than 5 years. And there are some exceptions to this, such as RPS contracts. Option 2 is for urgent procurement, allow approvals via Tier 3 advice letters, as decision 1911-016 did. And that decision specifically also required the inclusion of metrics used to compare all bids and also justification for any utility-owned assets. So similar concepts could be implemented. And then option 3 is to develop a common resource valuation methodology. So the methodology would be designed to support accurate and consistent measurement of the value of resources. And components could include things such as capacity value, energy value, resiliency of wildfire, vulnerability mitigation value. And the intention here is that it would be complementary to other options and would allow LSEs to more flexibly to have more flexibility in their contract approval process if they used this methodology adopted by the CPUC. The next step, next slide, is the compliance monitoring and enforcement. So the issues include ensuring appropriate incentives and disincentives are in place, designing the CPUC's role in enforcement consistent with its authority, which is a question that came up earlier in this workshop. Providing the CPUC access to information of sufficient detail and timeliness to effectively monitor compliance, determining when and how noncompliance will be assessed, and ensuring that corrective actions can occur in time for the need, and finally, aligning with other parts of the procurement process, particularly need allocation and procurement and operating and entity direction. So we have 2 options for this step. Next slide, David, thank you. So the first option is to maintain the current monitoring approach. So this would mean that annual progress reports and milestone demonstrations would be determined by each procurement order, and the compliance monitoring structure of decision 1911-016 could be used as a template for that. Option 2, in contrast to the ad hoc approach of option 1, would develop a standard method for establishing monitoring milestones and triggers for corrective action. So a standard method could aim to address issues such as how to strike the balance between LSEs having sufficient time to take procurement action versus the central procurement entity stepping in and having adequate time to react if an LSE fails to meet a milestone. Also, what an LSE's milestone demonstrations should entail. And additionally, one concept that we proposed under this option in the staff proposal is that RFIs, or request for information, could be used as a method to obtain information, which would then be used to develop more precise milestones, milestones better tailored to the specific needs and potentially reflecting the knowledge about potential procurement options out there. The idea is that with the use of RFIs, you could potentially strike that better balance, for example, between LSEs having sufficient time, but also being able to adequately react and basically having more knowledge and better expectations of the time required and what options lie out there. All right, next slide. So the proposal also lays out 2 enforcement options. So this is a step that I'll state up front needs to be further developed. And so when it's time for comments, we certainly do welcome any ideas here. So option 1 is to use the threat of just-in-time backstop procurement to incentivize self-providing LSEs to succeed. So this reflects the approach that's used in decision 19-11-016. And so under this option, really the CPUC steps in to procure and the LSEs bear the backstop procurement costs. The second option would be to develop an IRP. Oh, sorry, I think that was a typo. Basically, an IRP enforcement mechanism. And we recognize that this is not a well-developed option, but the idea would be to set rules, penalties to really establish those disincentives, and we could draw on existing programs where applicable. All right, next slide. And so finally, we have incorporation into the planning process. So if you think back to the schematic I presented near the beginning of the workshop, this is the arrow that was going from the last procurement step back to the planning track to maintain that strong link between the two. And the questions that the framework should answer include, if the CPUC directs procurement through multiple orders, how can the CPUC prevent inconsistency in the signal sent to LSEs and the market? Following a procurement order, how certain should it be assumed that the resource needs will be met? And should procurement orders automatically be incorporated into future IRP modeling baselines for RSP development? Next slide. So the framework includes 3 options on this issue. The first option is to incorporate the full amount of procurement ordered into the RSP or the PSP baseline. So you would assume the full amount of the procurement ordered as a fixed input to future optimizations of incremental candidate resources. So essentially meaning that the ordered amount would be considered as good as contracted and don't need to worry about it, just worry about the incremental need. In contrast, option 2 would incorporate resources into the reference system plan or the preferred system plan modeling baseline only once the procurement is contracted and approved by the CPUC. And so this option would rely on the information in the contracts, including commercial operations date and various the resource attributes. And this would be used to update the baseline used in our modeling. So under this option, the portion of the ordered procurement amount not yet contracted would be reevaluated. So it could be found that that amount could no longer be necessary, or the need could be specified differently once reevaluated. Option 3 is kind of a hybrid, and it's to develop an in-procurement resource category within the planning track of IRP. So procurement ordered but not yet online would not be identified as a procurement need again if any of the below if criteria are met. So essentially, if these criteria are met, then we would not consider these resources in the baseline. So, or they are not certain. However, once evaluated, they would kind of be set aside, and new procurement orders would not include this amount. So the criteria include LSE, if an LSE would meet a designated milestone, if a central procurement entity is designated to execute procurement and has conducted a viability assessment, or if the procurement need requires new transmission development that has been assessed by the CPUC and approved by the CAISO. So essentially all of these three criteria, which do serve as a starting point, basically indicate that there is more certainty to these specific resources because they meet this criteria, and therefore we would not reevaluate them, but we would also in our modeling not consider them to be as good as contracted. All right, next slide, David. I think, yes, time for questions.
I believe Deb Emerson, I'm sorry, hold on. I lost you on the view here. Okay, Deb Emerson, go ahead.
This is Deb Emerson from Sunem Clean Power. I was curious on the option 2 of the compliance when you stated that you would allow for adequate time to make sure that the commission understands that we shouldn't be penalized for existing transactions that maybe don't meet those standard methods that may be determined, and or for transactions that are currently underway right now that are not yet developed for those projects. Just because if there is a standard methodology in which all LSEs should be following, that would certainly be brought into an RFO process and likely subsequent contracts that come as a result of those RFOs.
Just to clarify, is there a specific question in there? Apologies if I missed it.
Yeah, I think I just want to know, when you say adequate timeline, does that mean 6 months for the order, or what is considered adequate timeline so that LSEs are not penalized for not using the standard methodology that may be developed?
I see. And David, can you go back to the slide? So you're referring to the second, you said monitoring option? Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. So I think, the option, so the standard method could be designed in a way where there is a standard, but it really is dependent on the technology type and on a number of factors. So I think the issue that you're raising is an important one, and we would have to absolutely determine, how it could be considered so that some, flexibility is retained.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. If there's particularly concern or proposal, I think when we get around to comments, we'd love to hear from you on ways to kind of avoid that conundrum.
Thanks, Nathan. Just checking. Damon, do you have another question? Damon Franz?
It's in the IRP that new build contracts.
No, I guess not. No other hands raised at this time.
David, I see 2 questions in the Q&A, which maybe I can read out, and I'll take a first stab at. Neil, Karolina, others, obviously feel free to jump in, but I think they're both kind of pertaining to the common resource valuation method content that was just covered a couple minutes ago. The first is from Ed Smeloff. What provisions, if any, in procurement approval will there be to prioritize the development of new clean energy resources that directly benefit disadvantaged communities through job creation and economic development? Ed, good question. Seeing this from a CRVM perspective, if that's how you intended it, that would still kind of be downstream of the content that's currently in this proposal. But basically, if CRVM is a route that we'd end up going, and that's still very much TBD. We'd then be putting out at a later date kind of proposal for how the different value elements of evaluation framework would look, and those would definitely be part of the consideration. Similarly, Tom Beach asked, can you explain in more detail how the CRVM process would provide LSCs with more flexibility in the approval process? That's a good question, and Karolina, Neil, feel free to correct me, but my interpretation here is that when we say flexibility, it's kind of flexibility compared to the alternative, which in my view is, to put it super simply, maybe too simply, if you see a world where you'd either have the PUC making a very kind of pointed procurement order and being directive about what resource types to go get, when, et cetera, versus a CRVM world where maybe the PUC doesn't make very pointed orders and just has an agreed upon resource valuation methodology that everyone's going to use. The PUC order can be, in that scenario, considerably less stringent or specific, which would allow LSCs, in my impression, some more latitude to actually go procure things that meet their needs.
Yes, Nathan, I don't have anything to add on that second one. I think that's correct. And in regards to the first question, also the second option in the GHG reduction need determination section, using a clean resource standard, also in part is an alternative to the first option because it does try to kind of broaden the scope of things that could be considered, such as benefits to disadvantaged communities. So we welcome your ideas there on how to better incorporate that into that need determination there.
Okay, we're in the home stretch. Neil, you're on, maybe on mute.
I'm on mute, yes. I think first up, Karolina, will you lead into the way we've wrapped up the proposal?
Yeah.
I'll address next steps.
All right, so finally here we have a summary of the framework and also next steps. So the framework proposes a two-phased approach to implementing IRP procurement. So phase one applies to the current IRP cycle through 2021. This may include upcoming procurement orders to address mid-decade reliability needs and any procurement order during the consideration of the preferred system plan. And then phase two applies starting with the next IRP cycle. So more specifically, it's applicable to any procurement orders emanating from any future IRP cycles. Phase two would provide more time for the Commission and the stakeholders to figure out some of the more challenging issues that were raised at the start of this workshop by Molly. So issues such as what is an appropriate central procurement entity for long lead time resources, and for example, how non-IOU procurement can be incorporated into planning. Next slide. So to wrap up, I have here two flow charts, one for phase one and the other for phase two. And do not fear, the expectation is not that you will be able to read the details here, but if you would like to refer to them, you can find them in the executive summary of the framework, as well in the staff proposal, as well as in the conclusion. And I want to hit two main points here. So one is what Molly emphasized at the start, that the staff proposal is really a start, and we expect that parties will help us build on the proposal. So as you allow the ideas of today to really marinate, we hope that you do so through the lens of the guiding principles and the criteria. And so, you know, sometimes today we really walked through the options, and each option on its own aims to address a large issues. But in the future, we hope to refine not only the options, but also the framework as a whole. So it's the guiding principles and the procurement process steps as a whole that form this framework. So we hope that everyone will kind of take the time to think through the individual components, but also how all of these pieces really fit together and interact with one another to create kind of a well-functioning framework that helps achieve all of the guiding principles. So I think I'll leave everyone with that, and Neil, pass it to Neil for the next steps.
Yeah, thanks, Karolina. So yeah, this today has been a whirlwind tour of many topics. We realize that, and I know in putting for those of us who put together the staff proposal, we really appreciate the discussions we've had with Energy Division colleagues as well as stakeholders in industry, and not just in terms of this specific effort, but just from the input to IRP and other proceedings over the years. That those really form the sort of concepts and ideas in this, and so we really appreciate that. And so then on that note, yeah, we will be seeking more input soon. I think in early 2021 there'll be a ruling on midterm or mid-decade reliability needs, including those associated with Diablo Canyon retirement. The ruling will go to ordering considerations as well as the need analysis itself, and so then that would be the point to give feedback on those things. So I mean, I think that concludes the whirlwind tour we wanted to walk through in aid of helping stakeholders digest a long document. So we do have time now left for questions in general about the proposal, including picking up ones we didn't address. I could just start off perhaps trying to rephrase Mary Neal's question or restate Mary Neal's question and check I've got it right, and then off my response. Mary asked whether, in the context of need allocation, whether for Diablo the replacement, so the phase one, as Karolina described, the recommendations for phase one would include consideration of Diablo replacement. Would LSCs that have already undertaken procurement of resources, I think you gave the example of geothermal, Mary, would that be considered when allocating the need to LSCs? And so just checking the staff proposal for phase one, no, the recommendation there is that we would take the approach used for the November 2019 decision. The rationale there is just given the short time available and the difficulty of working through how to factor in. I think your question basically goes to LSC's portfolio positions. Yeah, so that's the staff proposal at this stage on that issue. But yeah, now I turn back to David and
thanks. Thanks, Neil. Mary Neal, that answered your question adequately. You're unmuted now.
Yes, it did. Thank you. But I do have other questions if you're willing to.
Let me come back to you, Mark Joseph.
Sure.
I'll be right back to Mark Joseph. You've been waiting patiently. Go ahead. You're unmuted.
Thank you. Mark Joseph on behalf of the Coalition of California Utility Employees. First, I want to thank the staff for an obviously huge amount of work that went into preparing this proposal and trying to address the procurement problem that we've had so far. One of the things that was not often mentioned throughout this presentation was the time each of the various steps was going to take. How long it's going to take to turn the crank and end up with new generation built, to address the fundamental problem which you're trying to address, which is procurement. And the time frame was not often mentioned. At the same time, the SB 100 report by the joint agencies, the PUC, Energy Commission, and Air Resources Board, is about to come out, and there have been several workshops on that. And that identifies that for each of the years between now and 2030, we need to be building new renewable generation at a pace which matches the peak record year in the past decade. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how to try to reconcile the fact that we need to be sprinting here. And it seems like the process that you've envisioned would not really be characterized as a sprint.
I can take a stab at starting that, and others feel free to jump in. Thanks for the input. I still think we might be getting beyond the clarifying question territory that I hope others adhere to, but we can provide a little input. My first reaction is that the bifurcation of the proposal's recommendations into phase 1 and phase 2 actually recognizes the idea that developing the things proposed in this paper will take some time, especially the more complex ones. And the distinction of phase 1 as something that we feel we can apply right away, I think is very much recognizing the fact that we know we have to move quickly, that analysis within IRP and from other agencies, as you note, kind of points towards the need to do record amounts of procurement every year for a large part of this decade, and we take that very seriously. So I think that we've tried to provide ourselves optionality between using kind of known or simpler tools at first to get some things going, while also kind of in parallel developing the more complex and possibly more robust tools that are contained in phase 2.
Let me take another stab at it, Mark, which is that if you look at the decision that the commission has already adopted in March of 2020, which is the latest IRP plan decision, and you look at the size of the bars between 2020 and 2030, they are huge. So, I don't think there is a disconnect between the SB 100 report and the already adopted IRP plan. I think the only thing that might be, sort of like a missing utterance is that, the commission said, this is what we think it's going to take. We think this stack is what, like 15 gigawatts or something. Nathan, I can't remember the exact number. And to meet 46 million metric tons. And what we haven't done, and we said to the LSEs, we said, go plan for it. And they submitted their plans to make all that procurement happen on September 1st. But what we haven't done is necessarily ordered it. So, I mean, if there's an order that comes out from the commission in 2021 with a very large procurement number, it should, from the perspective of the LSEs, let me just be candid, it should be sort of like a, not real news. It should be, yeah, this is what we were already planning to do, because the information is out there already. We didn't kind of like mandate it. That's this whole, we told them to plan for it, but then, do we also have to separately order it? And then if we order it, do we have to, maintain the compliance? So in some sense, I would say, we are already well underway in response to your comment of, what, have we not started yet? Does that make sense?
Thanks, Molly. All right, Mary Neal, a few more clarifying questions. Mary.
Great. I have a follow-up to my first question, which was about CCAs being allowed to submit their own proposals for satisfying renewable integration. And I know you guys talked about, in response to that, consideration of LLC plans. But if I look at figure 5, which I know Karolina presented earlier, there's an arrow between the RSP down to procurement need determination. And it sort of looks like that arrow bypasses the LLC plans. So am I interpreting that right? If there's a procurement order directly from the RSP, would that not consider the LLC plans?
Thanks, Mary. Sorry, I'm trying to process my own schematic here. So, okay, the point you're saying is that the arrow goes directly from the RSP to procurement need determination
Correct.
and passes which step?
Well, it intersects the arrows that go to the LSE development of the IRP plans, right? So you're just kind of going straight to procurement need determination without that planning step. So I'm wondering,
Right. So,
how.
I think part of it is that there are sort of multiple things happening in parallel. So, and it's challenging to capture all of that in a diagram, but on one hand, so RSP, a reference system plan can be created, and that kind of serves as a starting point for procurement need determination. All of that takes some time to go through the process, because if you remember, I don't know how close you are with the IRP process, but it takes LSEs some time to develop IRP plans. And so it's just kind of the syncing of the fact that the RSP takes place 1 year and the PSP takes place a following year, and just when the LSEs are actually creating their plans and when we're processing them, that it's almost as if it could flow into like the next procurement process cycle. So I'm not sure if that might be confusing you even more, but we can certainly think more about how to clarify that in here for any following work that we do on this.
Okay, thanks. I also have a question about for the long lead time resources, and there was an option that discusses a decision-making approach for determining what emerging technologies are included. And I'm confused of what that really means. Like, what does decision-making approach mean? Like, could you provide maybe an example? And when you talk about being included, does that mean like included for more analysis, like in Resolve, or just included directly in a portfolio for a procurement?
I think a portion of that is that we have designated candidate resources that we do evaluate, that we include in our model in Resolve. And then there are also, I think, specific technologies or candidate resources that may not necessarily be included in the model right now. I mean, one that comes to mind would be carbon capture and sequestration. But I think as technologies really evolve, because we want this to be a long-lasting framework that serves us for maybe decades to come, we just want to retain some of that flexibility. And that idea is not yet fully developed, but that's roughly what it's getting at.
Okay. And then another question about resource diversity. So the framework states that if a state's resource portfolio becomes skewed heavily towards a few resource types, that the CPUC may seek to increase resource diversity as a risk hedging mechanism. But does the staff framework account for any differences in CPUC jurisdiction over risk hedging practices for IOUs versus other LSEs? And if so, how?
I can have an attempt at that. I think it's, Mary, you're getting to a layer of detail beyond the concept raised there, which is important, but just not to say it's not important, just to say the staff proposal doesn't go into it. So I think it's making I think that topic lies in sort of issues to do with need determination. So it's very much a sort of aggregate system level thinking from the portfolio perspective. What are the risks in the portfolio? Does our modeling adequately sort of track the value of diversity or not? But then, yeah, you're getting to, okay, what does that mean for individual LSEs? And I think that's an important linkage to explore.
Okay, thanks. And I just have one more question. I think there's one other quote in the framework. It talks about for non-routine resources that the CPUC may expect to order procurement of resources that have higher costs than the least cost resources. But does that mean that the CPUC expects to procure resources that are not least cost? And if so, under what circumstances?
Okay, I think it's just, can I just chime in? I don't think that the staff proposal uses the tragedy of the commons term here, but the reality is that if every LSE only sought the least cost resources, we would have a completely non-diverse portfolio and probably not a reliable portfolio. And so, I think that the one of the intents that was stated in SB 350 and establishing the IRP process was to put the CPUC, in the middle of the mix to make sure that we don't have a tragedy of the commons situation where reliability GHG goals are sacrificed because LSEs are all, sort of self-providing in their least cost best interest, and that's the heart of what's going to make these kinds of decisions hard for the commission, is to say, do we have to actually do some mutual benefit procurement because no entity could or is willing to take it on, either because it's too big, it's too costly, it's too long lead time, it's not certain enough, it's a new technology. There's a whole host of reasons why LSEs can't take on some of the types of resources that may not be absolutely least cost, but from an IRP planning modeling result, there absolutely should be part of the mix.
Okay, great. I'm not sure I agree with everything you just stated, but I will not move beyond clarification at this time. So thank you very much for that response.
All right, I see no further hands raised. It's the lunch hour on the Friday before Christmas, Neil, and I think we've exhausted all the questions.
One more from the chat window.
Okay.
So this is, I think, on the previous section. Deborah Bayless from SEHA asked, a prior IRP decision required staff to develop a CRVM is D18218. Is there a timeline for the development of a CRVM required by that decision? Deborah, I really try to not get into, call it decision interpretation on behalf of parties. It is not my read of that decision that staff is required to develop CRVM. I think it uses the word should continue to develop. If that's the case, then kind of per my previous comments about CRVM answering a couple other questions a few minutes ago, if staff sees the need to go down that road, we would definitely put forward our thinking publicly, I think, as that decision also says we should do if we go that route, and make sure that we got stakeholder feedback, because I know a lot of you have great input on that kind of thing.
Thanks, Nathan. So just one last check for any overflow questions we haven't got to, David or Nathan.
Right. I think this would be a good time for me to just chime in and say again, you heard Karolina use the term marinate. We certainly know that there's a lot in this proposal, and we want parties to marinate on it, to think about what parts of it need to be explored further. We wanted to give people really, a long lead time before comments, no pun intended. So, as you're enjoying your holidays, which I hope you do enjoy, come back refreshed and ready to help us fill this out and figure out what can be prioritized. We hear you that it's complex, and I know you're all here because you understand that the reliability and of the system, the cost of the system, and the environmental impact of the system are important to all of us. And sort of to echo what Commissioner Randolph said yesterday in her closing remarks, let's keep doing the hard work.
So thank you. I do want to express, I know on behalf of everybody who's listening, thank you to the excellent team who led this proposal and this workshop today. They've really done a great job.
Thanks, Molly. And yeah, just adding thanks to all the great questions today. And we look forward to working with you on this in the new year. Thank you.